Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the 16th Symposium of Irish Studies in South America. I'm Dr. Camila Batista, Director of the Brazilian Association of Irish Studies, and I will chair this session on the Irish in Paris in 1922. I kindly ask our audience to leave their comments and questions in the YouTube chat. The link to the attendance list is in the description of this video. Now I will introduce our speakers. Dr. Ciaran ONeill is Usher Associate Professor in 19th Century History at Trinity College, Dublin. In 2014, he was the Spectris Marie Curie Fellow at the University of São Paulo. He is Principal Investigator on the Irish Artifice, Art, Culture and Power in Paris, 1922, working closely with the project research fellow Dr. Billy Shortall. Dr. Billy is visiting fellow at the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, University of Notre Dame. He is an art history PhD graduate from the School of Histories and Humanities, Trinity College, Dublin. His research is focused on the intersection between art and politics in post-independent Ireland. Drawing on Irish European and the US archival resources, his research traces national and international exhibitions funded by the nascent Irish administration from 1922 to 1934 and examines how they were harnessed for political purposes. Now, I pass over to you, Ciaran and Billy.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much to our chair, Camila Batista. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak at ABE from the president, Mariana Bolferina, and bom dia to all of the people that I was really lucky to spend time around in Sao Paulo. What seems like yesterday to me, but in fact was 2014 as part of the Spectris Marie Curie Fellowship Program. I had a wonderful, amazing summer, which I remember with nothing but fondness. And it's a real pleasure to come back and speak to everybody today. So in today's talk, myself and Billy, who's just been introduced to you, will talk about a little studied art exhibition held almost a century ago in Paris in 1922. It opened on the 28th of January and it ran for a month until the 26th of February. In today's talk, we're going to argue for its seminal importance in Irish art history and Irish cultural history. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes to set the context for the exhibition in terms of its politics and how it came to be cited in Paris and so on. And then I'm going to hand over to Billy. And it's really Billy's recent doctoral work, just finished in 2020 at Trinity College Dublin, supervised by Dr. Angela Griffith, that forms the core of this project, Irish Artifice. Billy will speak for about 25 minutes, a little bit longer than that maybe, before handing back to me. And then I will talk us through a series of commemorative events that we've planned with a series of partners to take place from January of next year in 1922 until about June to mark the importance of this exhibition and the politics around it. So I'm going to begin by just sharing some slides so you don't just have to look at my face for the rest of this time. And I'm going to begin with this image, which is taken in Paris as part of the political portion of the Irish, the World Congress of the Irish Race, as it was known. I'll explain it in a little bit. But what's important is to say that in early 1922, it must have seemed that Paris represented the future of Irish culture. And in January and February of that year, we can find the political class of Ireland broadly defined and really from across pro and anti-treaty sides, gathering together for what we would now recognize as a sort of political think-in in Paris, called the Congrès Mondial de Irlandais. So the World Congress of the Irish Race is how it's typically translated into English, and indeed what many of the people participating and designing the event would have called it at the time. So what was it? It was a program of cultural events designed to show what the world outside, that Irish culture could establish itself on the world stage at really a seminal and critical moment post League of Nations, as small nation states were really trying to attempt to take their place, in among the First Nations of the world and so on. And so you can see from this image really at a glance. I'm not going to go through everybody here, but you can see at the very center, Eamon de Valera, of course, you can see Countess Markovic, and the far right, you can see Shortall O'Kealig. So representing really the key figures in Irish politics in 1922, they were all in town for the other half of the World Congress of the Irish Race, which was this week-long political thinking. So alongside this political thinking, or maybe argument that was happening, was a prominent art exhibition. And it's the prominent art exhibition that really forms the core of what Billy and I are going to talk about today. What was it? It was a major exhibition held at Galerie Barbizonge, one of the main prominent modernist galleries in Paris. It cost the same amount of money to put together the art exhibition as it did to get all of these people to Paris for the political thinking. So it was a major expenditure by a pretty broke new state in 1922. Why Billy and I think it's terribly important and worth talking about today is that really it collects for the first time what we now recognize to be the canonical artists and works of the Irish Free State. In other words, it gathers together all of the major artists that we now recognize as fundamental to that nationalist and national moment. So people like Keating, John Lowry, the Yates sisters, just the whole broad spectrum of important modernist artists and important artists of the 1920s. And this is the gallery that the exhibition took place in, Barbizonge. The art exhibition is called Exposition d'Art Irlandais. And you can see here just some basic information, but a high-class Parisian art gallery that showed plenty of Matisse and Picasso and so on in the 19-teens, so quite famous of its time. And so a lot is happening in Paris in 1922, and that's why I'm sort of arguing that, for a brief period in 1922, it seemed like Paris may point to the future. So, for example, in the same month as this art exhibition is taking place, we have James Joyce publishing, what most scholars consider to be the first major Irish modernist novel, Ulysses, one of the most important pieces of literature of the 20th century. That happens in the same month as the exhibition is on show in Paris. And also we have people like the designer Eileen Gray, of course, recently sort of rediscovered in a way by Irish cultural historians. And her studio gallery, design and concept sort of headquarters, Galerie Jean Désert, was literally just around the corner from Galerie Barbizonge on Rue Faubourg Saint-Honoré in Paris. So there's a kind of a clustering of major moments in Irish cultural history that are happening in early 1922. In one short month, it seems that the cream of Irish politics, art, literature, and design all converge in Paris. And it's proof, perhaps, that a future existed for Ireland outside the confines of the Anglo-American. Paris offered a pathway that diverges from the colonial ties of London on one side of the Atlantic and the vulgar nouveau riche appeal of New York on the other. And we now know that that, of course, is a promise that isn't completely fulfilled, but it's nevertheless an interesting moment in time for us to consider, the position of Ireland as a sort of an emerging European nation. So the Congrès Mondial Irlandais was the brainchild of the Irish Republican Association of South Africa, in fact. So the suggestion for the Congress itself comes from outside of Ireland. It comes from the diaspora context, and that's really important. And I think doubly important because we're addressing today ABE, a sort of an Irish Studies Association that is, emblematic in the diaspora, works in Irish studies. And in fact, in some sense, the idea for this Parisian World Congress of the Irish Race comes from that same diaspora and diasporic context. They suggested to the Irish government in August of 1921, and that's at a time when the very emerging, about to split Irish government is trying to develop an entire system of Irish diplomacy from scratch. And you can see just from this image from the conference that's held in Paris, just even how multicultural and global in scale the delegates are. You can see in the background placards for Bolivia and Chile and Tasmania, as well as Italy and Ireland and so on. And some of these images from inside the conference are truly amazing. We'll come back to them in a moment. So we can tell from the National Archives files that, you know, the World Conference of the Irish Race, as it was called originally, but then became the Congress, is a South African idea in the first place. And you can see the internal memo here, which says that the suggestion is an admirable one. It's being acted upon, and it's hoped to bring off the conference in Paris or some other country next January. That's dated from August. And of course, I don't need to lecture at length this particular audience about what's happening in Ireland between August of 1921 and January of 1922, but it's an explosive period in Irish politics and Irish history. So obviously the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed in London, 14th of December 1921. There is an incredibly acrimonious split that's kind of ongoing from the 7th of January, when there's a narrow victory for the pro-treaty side. And both sides of the pro-treaty and anti-treaty divide will be represented in Paris just 2 weeks later. So really what Paris also represents, and why we think it's an interesting moment in Irish political as well as cultural history, is that it's really the last time some of these people will ever sit in the same room with one another and debate ideas. Very soon, Ireland is going to be convulsed into civil war, which will be well underway by the following summer. And so Paris is this hopeful staging point in some ways between Ireland of the truce and Ireland of the split. So then just a little bit of background on what the Irish race conventions and congresses were, because this wasn't the first World Congress of the Irish race to take place. So what happens is in January 22, we have Irish politicians and radicals gathering for a 5-day Congress of the Irish race, but that's in actual fact the 8th in a series of Irish race conventions that had first begun in 1881. But it would be a big mistake for us to consider them a deeply connected series. In actual fact, they're very loosely affiliated to each other and sometimes brought together for very different reasons. So I'm just going to give you a very quick sense of what the preceding World Congresses attempted to kind of achieve. So the very first one takes place in Chicago. Again, you know, diaspora heavy, this phenomenon. And it's essentially a Clan na Gael event, which is attempting to harness the energy of Parnell and the land war in a diaspora context. It's part fundraiser, and it's certainly mostly about advanced forms of nationalism and gathering money in the diasporic context. A very different Irish race convention takes place in Dublin in 1896, which is in fact really headed up by a Catholic, a home rule coalition. So it's a clergy-heavy convention with speeches from prominent Irish parliamentary party members like Edward Blake and so on. And really it's a sort of almost a Dominion or home rule era convention. 1916, back in New York City, we have 2,300 delegates meeting in the Hotel Astor. This is a fundraiser that operates under the banner of the Irish Race Convention, but is in actual fact a fundraiser for the Easter Rising, which will take place 6 weeks later. Same sort of thing happens in New York again in 1918, where the Friends of Irish Freedom put together a 2-day conference in January of 1918, but that's in fact a much more minor affair than the 1916 event. And so in the run-up to Paris of 1922, we have smaller Irish race conventions being taken place in Melbourne and Buenos Aires in 1921 and 1919. And Philadelphia back in 1919 was really the last big affair, where you had the Friends of Irish Freedom raising $5 million from 5,000 delegates that met in the old Irish nationalist heartland of Philadelphia. But this particular event was riven with accusations of corruption and a split within Sinn Féin. So there's a long history of these Éanach na Gaels, or Irish race conventions, or Congrès Mondial as it came to be known in Paris, and they all meet in some respects for sympathetic but different reasons. They're not deeply connected to each other, but they're all phenomenons of the diaspora. The person who was at the center of the Parisian meeting is Kathleen Hughes, who you can see here. A kind of a mysterious person. Padraig O'Shiel has written a biography of her 2014, which sheds some light on how she came to be so central. And she's really the main organizer for the Parisian conference. right up until the week it takes place when she's sort of displaced by Owen McNeill. The convention itself takes place in a number of locations, but L'Hôtel Continental is the main location, and the images that you've seen from the inside is the main kind of formal room within this very fashionable location in Paris. Basically, the Irish government was keen to make a visible splash, so they rented out some of the finest rooms and hotels in Paris in order to kind of establish the idea of Ireland on the world stage. There was also a motor tour of Paris, which was the thing that kicked off the week-long event, really, on Sunday, the 20th of January. So we see a motor car tour of Paris for delegates visiting places like La Bastille, the Irish College, Montmartre, the Pantheon, places that had some connection to Ireland, basically, before the conference proper began on Monday, 21st of January, beginning as, I'm a historian myself, so I'm perfectly comfortable with the fact that it begins with conference sessions covering Irish language, literature, and history. And at 9 p.m, there's a concert of Irish music. And this cultural program runs alongside the conference in Paris all week, basically. And you can see that each day, Tuesday, Wednesday, there's a different sort of theme to the day. Sometimes it's music, arts, physical culture. Then it's discussing the viability of an Irish World Association, that sort of diaspora mobilization happening in real time on the 23rd of January. And then Thursday and Friday, by which time the conference had really lost a great deal of energy, I think, we have conference sessions covering the economy and again, discussing the viability of an Irish World Association. You can see that there are theatrical performances included, which Billy might talk a little bit more about, but in the Salle Hoche, of course, a reference to General Hoche, who has a very deep connection to Ireland as well. So you can see that Riders to the Sea and The Rising of the Moon were also put on as part of the conference. So again, just to show you some images of what the interior looked like, what this major conference looked like. You've got Owen McNeill and Shanti O'Kealy here, both seminally important in 20th century Irish history. So really, again, just to give some sense of the exhibition happening alongside a major political event that also isn't very well understood, I think, in Irish history thus far. Again, another crowd shot here of delegates. There are 98 official delegates, but about 250 people altogether attending the event over the week, with people coming and going. De Valera, we might talk about this in questions, was entertainingly followed by the French Secret Service during his time in Paris at this event. Billy might be able to talk to that later. That's a pretty hilarious aside. And then just to tie it back to our Brazilian audience, because Brazil itself, of course, was represented at this Parisian World Congress. And you see here Padraig O'Mahony at Rio de Janeiro, John Hart at Pernambuco. Sorry if I've mangled the pronunciation, of PJ Little. These people will surely be known to our audience, but here they are at this centrally important event in Paris. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to hand over to Billy, who's going to talk us through the art exhibition, which is in some senses the more interesting and more novel half of the week, in a sense. So Billy, I'm going to hand over to you now, if that's okay.
Thanks, Ciaran, for that. And it might be a little bit of repetition with what you said, but not much. So associated with the Congress, the organisers presented not just the art exhibition, but the grand narrative of Irish culture and history. But there really was a particular emphasis on the exhibition of Irish art, the importance of which Ciaran mentioned already is emphasised by it costing nearly half the total cost of the Congress to a financially perilous state. As noted at an earlier Irish Race convention, positioning this event internationally visibly demonstrated that the Irish question is an international one and not a mere matter of internal English politics. Essentially, it was about bringing independent Ireland, unshackled from Britain, back into Europe and further legitimising the internationalism of the Irish independence movement. Paris, though, was also chosen as the venue because it was seen by many as the cultural capital of the world. While cultural expression was one of the leading features of Irish nationalism pre-1916, this was the first time as an independent state that art and culture was used to position the country internationally. It is a bold statement by the new state on the range, scale and quality of Irish culture and contemporary visual art and art industries in Ireland. they presented a public display of artistic independence to support their claims of political independence. Correspondence between the organisers in Paris and the politicians in Dublin, most notably George Noble, Count Plunkett, then Minister for Fine Art, Arthur Griffith and Eamon de Valera, stated that they wanted, and I quote, a propaganda value from the art exhibition. Today, we would say they wanted a diplomatic or soft power benefit. Before I delve into the exhibition itself, I'll just talk briefly about the other cultural offerings. It was hoped to exhibit Ireland's games and pastimes, as revived and supported by the Gaelic Athletic Association. But this couldn't be organised in time. So instead, J.J. Walsh TD delivered a lecture on Irish sport and athletics, during which he announced plans to hold the Tailteann Games. Now, the Tailteann Games are a sort of Irish National Olympics. And to give you a flavour of the nationalist tone of the Congress, these are some quotes here on the slide from the press release for these games issued in Paris. So he called the press, Walsh called the press together to announce the Tailteann Games and issued a press release. He also lectured on Irish sport. And this was one of a series of 10 lectures on Irish life and culture. And these can be seen as the pillars. Next slide there, Ciaran. These can be seen as the pillars on which the pre-Civil War administration envisaged building the new state. So I won't read them off, but they're there on the slide. Artist Jack Yates, and we'll see him in the next slide here, lectured on Irish art. Now, Yates was shy, and this is the only lecture he ever delivered. He was already a successful artist, and his motivation to get up on stage and deliver his personal views showed his commitment to his own Republican views and to promote a national art. This is also evidence in the text of his lecture. Okay, so we can see some of the lectures here on screen. We can see, as say, at the top row on the extreme right, that's Jack Yates. On the extreme right of the photograph with the unmistakable moustache, that's Douglas Hyde. I'm afraid on my screen, my head is covering him. In front of him, between him and Mary McSweeney, who's sitting in the front row, is Evelyn Gleeson. She spoke on art industries. Arthur Darley, who spoke in music, is also in the back row. And of course, you can see Countess Markovic in the front row with the Neo-Celtic brooch. And people always admire her shoes as well. But Douglas Hyde, who's on the right there, when he was speaking on the Irish language, he reviewed the work of the Gaelic League. His is the only lecture that the French diplomatic reports feature. The Parisian police produced daily reports for the Interior Ministry. And as well as expressing surprise that all contributions were in English, they commented that Hyde was humorous, well received by his audience, and that he spoke ironically about the English attitude. He was conciliatory and urged the Irish to forget the evil that had been done to them. Some of the actual text for these lectures are available, and there is contemporary reports on virtually all of them. It is fair to say that all contributions were nationalist and in tune with the leitmotif of the Congress in distinguishing Ireland from Britain, portraying the Irish as a gifted race steeped in an ancient history and possessing a unique culture. On Friday, the 27th of January, there was an evening, as Ciaran has already said, of Irish theatre staged for the attendees. 2 plays were performed: The Rising of the Moon by Lady Gregory and The Riders to the Sea by John Militant Singh. The former is a short patriotic play dealing with conflicting loyalties in Anglo-Irish relations. Singh's work is also a one-act play, a tragedy set on the Aran Islands in the west of Ireland, and it deals with the island's inhabitants' struggle against the brutality of the sea. Both plays were written in English, an example of what William Butler Yeats described in his lecture at the Congress as perfumed with an Irish idiom. The play implies a dialect derived from the rural West, where people spoke a form of English with sentences constructed in the structure of the Irish language. In reality, what Yeats was doing was he was excusing Irish writers writing in English rather than Irish. Both plays were performed by an amateur Irish drama group based in Paris and billed as the dramatic section of the Irish Club of Paris. Slide there, Ciaran. 2 evenings of Irish music on the theme of Irish struggles for independence consisted of ballads, hymns, and various airs played on a range of traditional Irish musical instruments like the fiddle, flute, the whistle, and these were staged in the Salle de Fête Hotel Continental. Chief organiser of the musical evenings, Arthur Darley, also delivered the lecture on Irish music and reinforced the nationalist aspirations of the concerts, declared that Ireland never bowed to a conqueror, and after centuries of suffering and persecution, still gloriously preserved her life in music, and she will once more be the land of song. Musical pieces performed were patriotic and related to Irish liberation. They recalled past battles, dashed hopes of political freedom and English atrocities, exampled by Hymn on the Battlefield, written by Irish revolutionary politician and artist Countess Markovic, and sung in Paris by Gerald Crofts, who himself had fought in Dublin during the 1916 Easter Rising. The piece, dedicated to the Irish Citizen Army, invoked past Irish martyrs. You can see Tone and Emmett over and others there as well. One other significant contemporary piece composed by Swan Hennessy, played both nights, was String Quartet dedicated to the memory of Terence MacSweeney. MacSweeney, Irish Republican and Lord Mayor of Cork, died in hunger strike in October 1920 in Brixton Prison, England, in protest to charges brought by the British authorities. His death brought the Irish political struggle to a worldwide audience, and MacSweeney's sister Mary attended the Congress. Many of the 37 musical pieces performed were older airs, such as Follow Me Up to Carlow, an Irish folk song commemorating the death of an army of 3,000 English soldiers in 1580, or James Clarence Mangan's poetic verse, My Dark Rosaleen, written in 1846 at the height of the famine. Rosaleen is an allegory for Ireland, and it references a litany of Ireland's sufferings, or of her sufferings. The associated exhibition of Irish art and arts and crafts, as Ciaran has said, ran for a month at another important venue, Gallery Barbesange on Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honoré, a large modern gallery noted for its contemporary art shows. And the Congress used large and luxurious venues as a visible statement of prosperity, pride, and ambition. They projected a confident new state and self-determining nation on a world stage. And as mentioned already, theatre and the Grand Ball were held in the opulent Salle Och, concerts in the Salle des Fêtes in the Hotel Continental, and the Grand Hotel and the Hotel d'Orsay were also used. The art exhibition was opened by Léon Benedict, the curator of the Musée de Luxembourg, and he opened it on behalf of the French Minister for Fine Art, who had been invited to open it. 94 mostly contemporary artists, Irish artists, craftspeople and societies exhibited 281 exhibits in various media. There were 100 paintings and sculpture, and the remainder in the arts and crafts categories. And by that I mean enamels, metalworks, embroideries, prints, stained glass, book bindings, and so on. And despite the realities of the political landscape post the War of Independence, the Paris Art Exhibition displayed work by artists and craftspeople from all parts of the island, and also reflected all traditions. And it really displayed an aspiration that art and culture was not partitioned. It probably also reflected the government's difficulty in accepting the absoluteness of geographic partition. Sited in Paris, one of the major cities, the art capital of the world, and in front of a multinational audience, the new state was making a political statement. This is who we are, and this is how we see ourselves. Just as they aimed for a politically separate and independent state, it was also important that Ireland's identity was unique and culturally separate and independent. In a way, culture and art paralleled the political. I got the slide there, Ciaran. Irish art was distinguished as independent, national, and not English to achieve the propaganda that Plunkett and the Dáil sought from the show. This had already started in the cultural lectures and continued in the art exhibition catalogue, which contained an essay by the most prominent French art critic of the time, Arsène Alexander. He also reviewed the show in the Figaro. His essay, entitled École Irlandaise, described the exhibition as the first outing of this Irish school of art, which is different to its English or Scottish equivalents, and I quote, proof of a separate independent race. Like Jack Yates in his lecture, Alexander saw the West of Ireland landscape as unique and the primary source material for artists. This also exemplified the veneration that was in much of Irish nationalist culture of the Western seaboard as the location of true Gaelic values. As the new state was emerging, the West of Ireland was invested with a cultural capital bestowed on it by Irish writers and artists and politicians, the essential source of national identity. The assumption or assertion in Synge's plays, Yates and Henry's artworks, is that something something essential, authentically Irish and uncompromisingly Gaelic survived and still endured in that culture, more so than in the English-influenced East. This Irish landscape here on the screen, and the Irish landscape in the west of Ireland in particular, was well represented in the show. An example here by Paulhenry, and here again, as in the others, was presented as uniquely Irish and Gaelic. Henry had 6 paintings in the show. Benedict, who had opened the show on behalf of his minister, wrote to the same minister the next day, approving of the exhibition and proposing the purchase of this painting by Paulhenry for the Musée de Luxembourg collection. So a painting of a uniquely Irish scene entering an important French collection, authenticated Irish art, is recognition helping to achieve the propaganda value sought by the organisers. Countess Markovic, a slide there, please, sorry, had 6 works on display. In a widely reported contribution to a debate at the Congress, she referred to the hideous caricatures of Irish people by Cruikshank and other artists, which continue to present Irish people with simian features, uneducated, dirty, drunk and fighting, incapable of self-government and reliant on British rule. She said English propaganda had made Irish people the laughingstock of the world, and she urged counteracting this negative image. Also included was the work of the internationally renowned Irish painter John Lowry. The organisers, through Dermot OBrien, Sinn Féin's representative in London, obtained what they called his pictures of modern Irish history, including political portraits of Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins and Gavin Duffy, among others. Members of the revolutionary Dáil, declared illegal by the British administration, here they were presented as legitimate statesmen of a functioning state, a riposte to the well-worn colonial narrative of the Irish people being incapable of self-government. Lowry's portrait refuted these cliches. Lowry made the biggest impact with his painting of the funeral of Cork Lord Mayor Terence MacSweeney. As mentioned earlier in relation to the music concerts, MacSweeney had died in an English prison on hunger strike in October 1920. His death received international media attention and brought the Irish political struggle to a worldwide audience. When Lowry previously exhibited this painting in Glasgow in 1921, simply titled Southwark Cathedral, London 1920, the significance of the scene was lost. In Paris, it was titled Funeral of Terence MacSweeney, Lord Mayor of Cork. Lowry exaggerated the height of the church and the sunlight, picking out the Irish flag on the coffin as devices to add meaning to the painting. In another Lowry painting featuring the Irish flag, Blessing the Colours, he depicts the first blessing of the Irish tricolour. The Archbishop of Dublin blesses the flag in St. Mary's Pro-Cathedral. The new state is being baptised. Kneeling before the flag is a soldier in the Irish Free State Army uniform. The solemnity and importance of the occasion is heightened by the artist's use of muted tones and limited palette. The moment of consecrating the flag symbolises both the birth of a nation and the alliance of church and state at this critical juncture in Irish history. This Jack Yates exhibit, Bachelor's Walk in Memory, projects an image of Ireland as an innocent sufferer of English atrocities. Recalling an event he witnessed, or that the artist witnessed, of a flower seller leaving flowers at the spot where English soldiers shot 4 unarmed Dubliners dead and wounded over 30 in 1914. Academic and historian Roy Foster refers to the central figure who wears a shawl as a kind of Kathleen na Houlihan. The boy gives a sense of looking to the future and renewal after death. It is understandable why Yates decided to first exhibit this work, which was completed in 1915, 7 years later in this Paris exhibition. At this time, the destiny of Ireland, however imperfect, was beginning to unfold from its recent troubles, and that message was conveyed in this urban scene. That is, sacrificial death, hope and renewal, while Irish life goes on in the background. This was one of 4 paintings by Yates in the show. Patrick Toohey's subtle exhibit, Young Mayo Peasant, crossed from the overtly political, is subject a poor but confident youth with his and his country's future entwined before them. There were other portraits of Irish political figures and images of the Irish struggle. Irish literature and writers were also celebrated with sculptures of W.B. Yates, and we'll see him in the next slide, of Lord Dunsany and James Stephens, reinforcing what De Valera claimed at the Congress for Ireland's unique cultural tradition, and I quote, "the genius in the race and the magnificent culture, the grand things the nation could give to the world." Dermot OBrien, who was president of the Royal Hibernian Academy, exhibited a portrait of playwright Lennox Robinson, who no one really would consider nationalist, but the title was Lennox Robinson, author of Patriots and the Lost Leader. Adding the names of two nationalist plays Robinson wrote about Ireland's struggle for independence to the title imbues the author and the painting with nationalist credentials. All of these paintings were an important riposte to what Countess Markovic and a number of other conference speakers termed English propaganda. The arts and crafts section presented itself as part of a continuum from Irish medieval art. When items were being considered for exhibition, it was proposed to show some artifacts from the National Museum. This didn't materialize, but it shows that the intention was to exhibit these contemporary items in a visual continuum. The arts and crafts movement in Ireland distinguished itself from its English counterpart by being closely associated with the revived use of Celtic ornament. Irish stained glass had gained an international reputation at this time through exhibitors like Harry Clark and Tuairglenna, Bunamina Geddes and others, and here we have one from the show by Michael Healey. All glass works, bar the next one, by Clark, were religious and reinforced what historian Terence Brown and others state that at this time, Catholicism developed as a mark of national distinctiveness. Prints published by the Yates sisters' Coola Press depicted imagined views of a distinctive Irish life, such as the mountain farm or horse races on the strand, and distinctive Irish types, an island people, wearing wide brim hats and shawls. They depicted how Irish people had begun to see themselves set in their own place, proud, industrious, and independent. And the Coola Press was just one of a number of the pre-independence Celtic literary, artistic, revivalist cultural movements that provided a representation of Irish people who the British government or colonizer had politically failed to represent. So poets, artists, writers were presenting people with a view of themselves, in a way decolonizing the Irish visual imagination. And prints were part of popular culture since the early 1900s, and because they were cheaper and more widely disseminated than paintings, had more of an impact, particularly those that could stake claim as art. The next painting here, that's an exhibited painting executed by Sarah Purser while she was living in Paris, so it made a direct connection between Ireland and Paris and the Congress. It's now in the National Gallery of Ireland, and it's one of a large number of the works from the exhibition that are now in national collections, a testimony to the artistic quality of the show. And we have to remember, none of the paintings were in collections at the time of the exhibition. The majority of artists involved had caught the spirit of the time and all abandoned their academic designations. By that I mean none of the artists used their royal prefixes, Royal Hibernian Academy or the Royal Academy. Using the title would have been at odds with the leitmotif of the Congress and the exhibition, and the aim to create a political and cultural distance from the United Kingdom and anything royal. These artists who exhibited in Paris 1922, as Ciaran said, would go on to form the canon of Irish art over the succeeding decades, as documented in Irish art historiography. The clearly stated political purpose of the exhibition was propaganda, through a visual art approved by the state. Propaganda designed to persuade the international community to support Irish ideals. So we just go on next to, that's another exhibit. And yeah. So we can go back one, sorry. What they were saying that Ireland is a unique nation with a history invested in high art objects created in medieval times and continue today in our arts and crafts in metalwork, stained glass, and example here, embroidery, but also in other crafts. Which is also the next one there, to show the use of force by the British against a popular national movement was wrong, as we saw earlier in the Yates and Lowry works. This here is an image by Keating, Sean Keating, of Irish revolutionaries willing to take on the might of an empire. They wanted to present the Irish as an independent race. This was asserted by Arson Alexander in the exhibition catalogue, as was the uniqueness of Irish landscape painting. As a renowned international art critic, Alexander, as an external expert voice, was validating this. We've seen the slide already. And it's an unmistakable Irish landscape by Paulhenry, which was bought by the French government. The freshness and quality of this and other work was a counterweight to the cliched work created primarily for British patrons. The political portraits indicated a functioning government and were a counterweight to the British colonial cliche of a people incapable of self-government. Other images asserted that the Irish Republic was an actual functioning entity with images of everyday Irish life as shown in the Coola prints and in many other artworks. This self-portrait of Sean Keating and his wife in uniquely Irish dress in an Irish landscape, the artist in his own place. He was as close as the Irish national movement would come to having an official artist. Here, as in much of his work and the work of the show in general, the personal is the political. Both figures are dressed in what is clearly recognisable as West of Ireland or an Ireland dress, underlining the identification of the extreme West with a rugged and uncompromised Irish authenticity, creating an iconic image of how the new Nationalist Ireland saw itself, saying this is who we are and this is how we see ourselves, an artistically and culturally unique and independent nation. So,
okay, great. Thanks,
back
Billy.
to you, Ciaran.
That's great. So, I mean, just to round off, and before we go to discussion and questions, I suppose in the history of Irish art and literature, 1922 is a peak year of modernism, as well as a key stage in Ireland's long journey to modernity, you know, a complicated journey to modernity that some people would argue has only just sort of reached some sort of a conclusion. It offers us a sort of hinge point in history and memory, and like other seminal years like 1798 and 1916, 1922 is a year in Irish history that inspires book-length studies. It helps to bookend Irish history survey texts, and it can be used as a widely understood shorthand in popular culture to denote the beginning of an emergent Irish identity in the political and social imaginary. This Irish identity that emerged, it neither emerged nor stabilized in any sort of a vacuum. And those interested in articulating a separate identity for the Irish in 1922 had to contend with the intensity of its connections to other more influential polities and powers, and in particular across three competing cultural cities maybe that sort of stand for those powers: Paris, London, and New York. And it's really interesting that this conference and exhibition take place in Paris, in a sense, which we now understand to be maybe the weakest connection of all three, but it was aspirationally the most important in 1922. So the exhibition at Paris in 1922, as Billy has shown us, is arguably the key moment in modern Irish art history, particularly as it involves a convergence of politics, art, and propaganda to advocate for the existence of an Irish school of art that's distinguishable and different, in particular from the British school or the British traditions. That exhibition took place in Paris is doubly important, offering a non-Anglophone umbrella under which the so-called Irish school could shelter. 1922 illustrates the contingency of such decisions, and as we reckon with it a century later, it seems obvious that it was an isolated and somewhat anachronistic in some ways moment in time and space, soon to be overtaken by the three dominant forces that affect Irish culture in the decades either side of that year or after that year: Anglicization, Americanization, and Irish nationalism. So how should we think about the convention and the exhibition in Paris, and how should we commemorate it? A commemoration being a very tricky topic in Irish studies, broadly speaking, at the moment. So what we intend to do is next year, myself and Billy are going to take part in a series of 3 events across 3 main locations, all of which reference an attempt to capture something of the Irish cultural zeitgeist in 1922. So at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, where Billy is currently working right now, there will be an exhibition by the O'Brien Collection and the Snipe Museum of Art entitled "Who Do We Say We Are? Irish Art 1922-2022. It'll run from February to May 2022, so a nod to the original exhibition. And what it intends to do is gesture towards the themes of the exhibition in 1922, but as well as in our present, really looking back over the 100 years and beyond between that point and now. And that's going to be funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs. In Paris itself, of course, we couldn't not do something in Paris. We're going to be running a series of lectures at the Centre Culturel Paris. So some of you will have been there, an amazing location right beside the Pantheon in Paris. And of course, an original stop on the 1922 motor car tour. This will be headed up by partners in CCI. They're going to run an exhibition of contemporary Irish art that really attempts to interrogate what Irish art is now and how it relates to the world around us, as well as the state or states of Ireland in 2022. So Paris will look to the present and the future a little bit more. And finally, at Trinity College Dublin, this portion funded by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media under the second phase of the Decade of Centenaries programming. And what's going to happen in Trinity is Billy and I will deliver two major contributions. The first is going to be a digital recreation of the exhibition in 1922, featuring a custom-built digital evocation of the Galerie Barbizonge itself, featuring about 100 of the almost 300 artworks that were originally exhibited and offering contextual information on each one. That's what Billy's currently working on at the moment. The project website is scheduled to launch on the same day as the original exhibition, so 25th of January 2022. And it will also include a great deal of information on the World Congress of the Irish Race, the lecture series, the cultural program, all the ancillary events that we've been describing in this talk. We'll attempt to contextualize in that website. And in June of 2022, to round it off, we're going to convene a conference at Trinity Longroom Hub, where I'm deputy director and where Billy will be based by then, to consider the conference and exhibition in its wider global context. Again, collaborating with Notre Dame, CCI and the Department of Tourism and DFA and so on. And we envisage a publication hopefully arising from that. So that's just to let you know what we're going to be doing over the next sort of 6, 7 or 8 months into the maybe next summer. But really, before we go to discussion, I want to stop and wonder what is the point of doing all this. And I mean, I'm somebody who teaches commemorations as part of public history in Trinity. And in a sense, I've always taken a skeptic line on the value of commemorations. And I think that's worth doing and worth thinking about critically. So why are we doing a series of commemorative events? Well, firstly, because we think the Paris exhibition is a genuinely pivotal moment in Irish art and cultural history that's poorly understood and deserves wider attention. So in that sense, our work is historical, especially the Trinity portion of it. And it's also an act of recovery in some ways. Secondly, we want our suite of events and outputs to actively interrogate the complex relationship and power dynamics between the Irish state, its people, and Irish art and the artists who make it. We want to query the ways that the state depends on artists right up to the present for propagandic and sometimes quite cynical reasons to provide a visual and brand identity for Ireland on the world stage, and often at low, sometimes quite exploitative cost. We want to ask if that relationship has changed and who are the winners and losers in it. In other words, and before I hand back to our chair, what we want is to use this commemoration, series of events of commemoration, to query our present as well as the past and really interrogate those complex power relations at the center that are asked, in a sense, by the topic. Okay.
Thank you, Ciaran and Billy, for such an amazing talk. It's interesting to see that the year 1922 is important worldwide, for Brazil too. The Brazilian Modernist Art Week also happened in 1922 in February, and it's considered a landmark for modernism in Brazil. But I have a question to you about the political tension during the Congress, because there were two rival groups there. How did this tension affect the Congress, or was there any tension that was possible to see or apprehend during the Congress?
Billy, I might hand that to you, and then I'll comment if need be.
There was quite a lot of tension, and it's interesting to look at the French diplomatic reports. You know, on day one, they're very long, but they didn't understand the full what the words meant. People wanted full national ideals or national ideals. Full meant it was anti-treaty, and national ideals meant it was the pro-treaty side. So, but also the politicians and the people participating in the conference, in the Congress, that didn't want to expose their disagreements to the public. So they held a number of sessions and close a number of sessions to the public and to the press to avoid sort of displaying a public conflict. But what I would say is that they all attended the cultural lectures, they all attended the theatre, most of them, as far as I can see, visited the art exhibition. So art and culture was something both sides could embrace, that there was no argument, and had a very uniting element on the group that were there,
Billy, would I be right to say that there was a kind of a factional element, though, like as in there was a clear grouping around De Valera and so?
Absolutely, there was a clear grouping around De Valera, and the other grouping, I suppose, was loosely around ONeill, but the majority of delegates were anti-treaty. So at the meeting, the De Valera faction would have had the upper hand.
Okay. And my other question was about the participation of women in the Congress, because we can see in the pictures Countess Markovic and the organizing Ms. Hughes. But what was the participation of women in this Congress, both as organizers, politicians, or as artists?
Yeah, it's Catherine Hughes was the main organizer, but it's interesting that in contemporary reports she's hardly mentioned. It's only later it came to light that she was the sort of dynamo behind everything. In the series of lectures, there was only one woman speaker, and that was Evelyn Gleeson, who spoke on Irish design or Irish arts and crafts. And Countess Markovic would have been the only notable woman who made a contribution during the political debates in the Congress as well. So despite looking at the photographs and seeing a large number of women in the photographs, those who actively contributed was relatively small. But saying that, the whole thing wouldn't have happened at all without Catherine Hughes.
It's also just to follow up on that, and Billy, I think we'll be able to speak to this. I think one of the reasons we're really interested in this event is that women in the political side of things seem to be used almost more symbolically, right? I mean, you have Markovic, who actually traverses both the art exhibition and the political sort of week. Most people don't, but many of the other women who were there are kind of almost symbolically important, like obviously McSweeney and so on. But in the art exhibition, what you have is a very strong representation of female artists, and there's an interesting process, I think, at least from my perspective as a historian. Almost instantaneously, the importance of women to the political conference is actively kind of scrubbed out. So you have the removal of Catherine Hughes, even at the time the conference is ongoing, sort of being scrubbed out of the official record. But the process of Irish female artists who are very prominent at the beginning of this canonical moment being scrubbed out, that seems to take a little bit longer. But the common denominator is that through the 20s and 30s, women become less prominent than they seem here in 1922. And I think that's really interesting. And I think, Billy, it's one of the standout features of the Parisian exhibition, how many women are in it.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I look at art exhibitions right up till 1934 and even after, but up until 34, like state-sponsored art exhibitions, they're generally fairly 50-50 between male and female participation. And that would have been the same in Paris. In fact, when we look at the paintings, when we take the craft work into consideration, there's probably more female cultural participations than male.
Okay, we have some questions from the audience. Mariana Bolfarini asked you, up to what extent was the Congress effective in terms of building international networks of solidarity?
So, I mean, interestingly, like the diplomatic history side of this is possibly one of the best covered in the scholarship. So there's not much direct scholarship on the events themselves of the week, and not a deep understanding of it. But in terms of their role in diplomatic history, so Gerard Keown has written quite a good article and also a monograph, which people can go and read. I'm happy to stick it in the chat, actually, Camila, where he thinks about the political significance of the conference in Paris. And Dermot Keown has a really good article as well. And Billy can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the third article that's a really good one to go and read about its diplomatic significance will be Gerard Moran's. So those are the three main, and they're all particularly focused on its importance or non-importance, depending which way you look at it in terms of diplomatic history. But it's clear from the Keown sort of argument, I hope I'm not misrepresenting it if he happens to be on, it's clear that in a sense it's incredibly important. It almost promises a future that doesn't quite happen because of the split and then the Civil War and so on. But it's the foundation of what will later become the Department of Foreign Affairs and the diplomatic service. And I think, you know, as a 19th century historian, one of the definitions I often use to sort of prove that Ireland, you know, during the Act of Union doesn't achieve anything like full statehood is the fact that we don't have control over our exchequer, we don't have control over our security or military positioning. And the third thing we don't have control over is the possibility to make diplomatic representations. That's really a key part of becoming a nation, you know, in that modern sense in the early 20th century. And Ireland is at this point in 1921, 22, just starting to do that. And you can see how they turn to the diaspora as a resource. And of course, we still do this. That's still a key cornerstone of Irish diplomatic relations, is to sort of leverage or depend upon or you know, pick your word, but absolutely the diaspora is always central to the way that we present ourselves to the wider world. So that would be, I'll send those little references in the chat.
And there is a comment from Victor Alevato. He mentions that Joyce mentions James Maxwell in his poem "The Right Heart in the Wrong Place." Let me see if there. Okay. So it's a comment only about the, you know, this mention by Joyce in his poem.
Just to mention that William Butler Yates delivered one of the lectures, and both Yates and his wife, and Ezra Pound and his wife, and James Joyce and Nora Barnacle met for dinner one evening during the Congress. So when you consider that it was only literally less than 2 weeks before Ulysses was published, it's impossible to think that they didn't discuss Ulysses at their meal that evening.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, let me see. Are there any more questions from the audience? Well, I don't think there is. Okay, so most of the comments here on YouTube, thank you for your lecture. Okay, there is also a comment by Eduardo, the choice of typefaces used in the posters of the exhibition is very interesting. Okay, but I don't think, okay, there is one more comment here by Gisele. She really enjoyed the reference to the paintings by Susan Yates, Sean Keating, and Paulhenry. And her question is, how all these paintings configure national identity and get mixed up with British identity from the foreign perspective?
And so just to be clear about that, Camila, so is the question about whether these can also be seen as British paintings, or you know, how to frame them, or?
Yes, she wonders how all these paintings configure national identity first, and if they get mixed up with British identity by, you know, a foreign look, from a foreign perspective.
Well, I think there would be a strong emphasis on landscape and West of Ireland landscape, and that would generally be portrayed as uniquely Irish. So I doesn't normally get confused. Even the thatched cottages they're different. They're painted different, and this was explained in the catalogue by Alexander as well in his essay. Now it has to be remembered that in 1920 up until 1900, really, the painting that dominated in Ireland would have been that commissioned by the Anglo-Irish, by the wealthy landlords, and they were usually sort of estate paintings, painting of their farms, very controlled, or society portraits. So when Paulhenry, for example, painted that view of the West, it would have been unlike anything that people had seen before. So what was painted before was really an English version of Irish landscape, and then these painters like Henry and Keating and Yates. They came along and really painted a sort of, if you like, an Irish version. So, and this is the first time we give Irish people a view of their country from their point of view. And this is what I mean by, the Irish visual imagination had to be decolonized, because all the reference points to this for colonial or English. The other thing I would say as well is that I spoke about print being a popular medium. So when you think of the caricatures or the cartoons of Irish people that were portrayed in the English press, and to a lesser extent, but also in the American press, they were widely disseminated, and they were the views that Irish people were being given of themselves. So by Keating painting that self-portrait of himself and his wife, or that Patrick Toohey, it's a very simple one of a poor Irish from the west of Ireland. It gave people a view of themselves, that wasn't designed for a colonial audience.
But Billy, not just to kind of tag on to the end of that question, what's kind of interesting about that Toohey one is it's reminiscent of a lot of the Breton school of painting of kind of up close everyday life. So there's a kind of a subplot here of, a different like form of cosmopolitan kind of influence that is not really being named, but is being used to delegitimate the connection to Britain. But in actual fact, is in some ways just a connection to France and the epicenter.
And it also attaches, in that case, him to the land. But also the Henrys, he was painting a landscape that was a contested space. He in a way, he was visually returning ownership of the land to the people that worked it, that dug the turf, and also, I didn't show there, but in the people that he painted on the land, he was returning ownership of the land to them, and it was a contest. So they're highly political as well from that point of view. But as is mentioned in the Yates prints, they almost had a pictorial language. It had this particular Irish features, or the way they dressed, and the hats and the shawls. So it was to create this sort of Irish identity and give people a view of themselves in their own place.
Okay, I saw that Giselle wrote in the chat that it's from a foreign perspective, from people who have never studied much about Irish nationalism, for example. They may associate these paintings with Britain. So maybe that is a point of confluence to the Brazilian Modernist Week, as I mentioned before, and 200 years of independence of Brazil from Portugal, because the Modernist Week here in Brazil also attempted to create a Brazilian image, to detach this image from Portugal, from the previous colonizer. Okay, so let me check if there is any other comment. I don't think so. So let me thank you, Ciaran, and you, Billy, for the amazing presentation. It was very interesting. I had never heard about, the Irish in 1922 before, so it was very enlightening. And we invite you all to our next session at 2 p.m. Brazilian time. The plenary Subversive Joy in the Chaosmos, James Joyce Revolution, by Bartholomew Ryan from Universidade Nova de Lisboa, here at YouTube, a base YouTube channel. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you very much.